Um, good, good morning. I'm Van Jones. I am honored to be here. Breakdowns can lead to breakthroughs if you use them right. And this conversation, I think, may be one of the most important conversations happening in the country. It's how do we, now that we have the awareness that we have about what's gone wrong with racial justice in our country, do something about it? I think at the beginning of the year, if you had said that racial justice would be perhaps the number one issue in the United States, maybe around the world, you might have had some doubts about that. But after the COVID crisis, uh, disproportionately hurt African Americans and people of color, both economically and from a public health standpoint, people started to pay more attention. And then we had the racial unrest after the tragic killing of George Floyd, and tens of millions of people around the world marching, calling for change. And now, even within the context of our presidential election, this issue of racial justice has come up. I'm going to say to you, as someone who pays a lot of attention to politics, I don't know if help is on the way from the public sector. But I do know that with this much attention, we now have an audience listening. And we are fortunate to have some of the greatest minds on the planet on this issue ready to talk with us today about what can be done positively to change these outcomes, to move the bottom line, to make more money, to make more of a difference, and to make the world and the country better. Stop wasting genius and start making more positive outcomes. Three of the best minds in the world are with us. One is Catherine Mann. She is the global chief economist at Citigroup. She's got MIT background, a Harvard background. Her brain's been weaponized now on this issue. We're going to hear from her. We also have Mellody Hobson, CEO and president of Ariel Investment, co-CEO, but also a rock star in her own right, and has been front lines with Starbucks and so many groups. She's put her shoulder to the wheel. She knows how to get it done. And then obviously Robert Smith, who has been an incredible champion, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and even walking now the halls of DC, trying to make a tremendous difference. He is the CEO and chairman of Vista Equity Partnership. So you could not have a better panel. I mean, you literally could not have a better panel. And I want to start with you, Catherine. You have been using your incredible research power at Citigroup to try to really look at these numbers and figure out what's going wrong. And you found out that over the past 20 years, because of this racial opportunity gap, wealth gap, income gap, the country has lost about $16 trillion. So this isn't just hurting African Americans, it's hurting the entire country. Talk a little bit about that study and how you came to that number, $16 trillion, and how can we be wasting this much genius in the United States of America in 2020?
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. It really is really a special case for us to be able to be here to talk about this issue. Although I will note, as the organizers said, this was on the table for the Milken Institute before COVID and before the killings of George Floyd and others. So let me say first, we've built on research that's been in the academic community and the policy community. We've built that research. We've brought it together. I think that's the important point, is that we have brought together the research to present a coherent picture of the several different gaps that face the macroeconomy. This is a macroeconomic problem. If you have income gaps that come from wage differentials, if you have gaps, if you have housing gaps, which generate wealth gaps, if you have entrepreneurship and business gaps, if you were to close those gaps, if you didn't have them, that's where you get the macroeconomic benefit from. You have a bigger economic pie. Everybody benefits from the bigger economic pie, not only the individuals who have greater opportunity, but the macroeconomy as a whole. And that's the point we wanted to make, is an awful lot of money is being left on the table by having these gaps and having these gaps persist. Going forward, we could close them now. If we could magically snap our fingers and close those gaps now, we would have 5 trillion more over the next 5 years. It's kind of a nice number. And that adds about 0.3 percentage points to US growth, which in the context of COVID is a very important addition to the US economy.
Well, I know that you at Citi have some ideas you're going to be rolling out. We're going to talk about those, but I just want to kind of get get all the way around the circle a couple of times, because I know you're not just thinking about it, you're actually going to be doing some stuff about it. I want to move over to Mellody. Now, look, I think you're almost like the poster person. I don't want to use the wrong term, but as somebody who, way before this was popular, way before this was being talked about by everybody, you were a huge champion, effective at Starbucks, DreamWorks Animation, so many places where you showed up, and also in the media. What is in the way? We'll get to that in a second. What is actually holding back progress from your point of view? You've had to go through these glass ceilings multiple times. You've seen other people try to navigate it. We've got an audience of people who I think are probably leaning forward in a different way than ever. Take this moment to explain the challenge of being an African American, moving through these environments and getting to the place where you are right now.
Well, certainly that would probably take us the entire panel to walk you through that narrative, but I'll get right to the point that I think you're making. What is in the way? From my perspective, it's accountability. I've been saying this for a while, talk is cheap, and we need to make sure that there's action. At Ariel, we have said for years, we've admired this problem long enough. It's time to do things about it. And what do? We hold institutions and individuals accountable. So a very simple way, incentives. You get what you incent. Everything else in corporate America, we get measured and we get paid if we make it happen, and we don't get paid or we lose our job if it doesn't happen. The only area where that is not true is diversity. People say over and over again, we're working on it. This is the only area that you could work on for a very long period of time and not show meaningful progress and keep your job. You cannot work on earnings. You cannot work on a product launch. Those things are make or break. And yet we say that diversity in corporate America is mission critical, but working on it seems to be, or has been, good enough. It reminds me of when I was a kid. When I was a kid, my math teacher would give me credit for showing my work, even if I got the wrong answer. Corporate America wants credit for showing its work, but we're getting the wrong answer. If we can line up incentives, pay for performance like we do for everything else, performance around diversity, I think we'll move the needle in a meaningful way.
Well, we're going to have a chance to talk about that and how we make that happen. And so we've talked about the big macro picture. We've talked about how people trying to move up the ladder in corporate America need to have the benefit of some accountability. And then the third piece of this is capital, the actual ability of African American entrepreneurs, innovators, leaders of banking institutions and others to just get their hands on actual dollars. Nobody has been more outspoken in this past year about the challenges of that and the importance of that. And, Robert, if you could just talk a little bit about this 2% solution that you have, which seems to be an elegant solution to try to at least bridge some of the wealth gap by getting capital to where it needs to be.
Sure. And thank you, Van and Catherine and Mellody. Pleasure to be on this panel with you. I think, Van, we still have to hold one truth that, capitalism is still the most efficient system on the planet for really uplifting humanity generally. But, African Americans have long not had an opportunity to participate really in the uplift in that opportunity. And you can look at some of the legislative and structural issues, Homestead Act, Southern Homestead Act, and redlining, et cetera, et cetera. But they have all manifested now in, I'll call these capital deserts that plague our communities. You and I have chatted about this, a number of times, Van. 70% of African American communities actually do not have a branch bank in that community. And if you don't have capacity to deliver capital through banking infrastructure, then it is unlikely that capital will flow into businesses, unlikely that it will flow into the communities in ways that can create sustainable opportunities for the members of that community. And we have now been focused on building out those banking systems. On the one hand, there's the capillary banking systems, the community development financial institutions, minority depository institutions, which are woefully undercapitalized and frankly under-modernized. And so we're taking that on as a way to drive, call it life through lifeblood of capital into those communities. And also I've seen over, the last couple of months, which is great, the larger banks, from JP Morgan, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and others, Bank of America now saying, listen, we have a role in this to play, which is part of this 2% solution. How can every company, to Melody's point, say, let's be accountable, create goals, incentives, go make it happen, hold ourselves accountable to making that happen. The 2% solution is designed to say, all right, take 2% of your earnings and drive them into, actual solutions over the next 10 years. To solve the income gap and wealth gap and disparity through building and leveraging what you have access to, which are the assets of your corporation, to be effective. And one of the more innovative ways to fund this was just actually released 3 weeks ago by Bank of America. They offer this Equity Progress Sustainability Bond, $2 billion bond, 2.5 times oversubscribed, which is designed to actually attack exactly that. How do they build out infrastructure for investments, for factoring dollars for small to medium businesses in these communities? And if every large corporation really goes down that path, here's a way to finance it quite effectively and really make real change that's measurable, that changes the whole dynamic of the economic position of people in those communities.
Well, I want to come back to that, because one of the things I didn't realize was how effective and smart it is to get capital to the Black banks that are already doing such a good job getting money to Black entrepreneurs. And yet those banks that have an unbelievable amount of smarts about how to solve this problem at the ground level, they don't have the money. If they're insured like everybody else. If you could figure out a way to get more money to the Black banks get the money to the entrepreneurs could solve a bunch of problems. So you've identified, I think, a very innovative solution and solution set. I want to come back to
that just quickly, Ben. I mean, it's not just the capital into the banks. You have to modernize the banks. I'll give you an example. Bill Bynum runs Hope, which is a CDFI in the Delta. And, prior to the work that we did with him and et cetera, they did 50 loans in a year. And now they've done 17,000 plus loans in 5 months. But part of it is modernization. It is capability and training, and then, of course, capital driven through these modern technical infrastructures to deliver more efficient lending capacity.
And that's what I think is great about your approach. And as we come back to Catherine, there are assets in the Black community. Often the conversation about the Black community is a conversation about what we don't have. And yet there are Black businesses, there are Black banks, there are Black professionals who are thirsty for opportunity and investment, and yet have had a difficult time getting that. And I think often if we could just focus on helping what's working work better, we could get a lot more done. And at Citibank, you seem to have gotten that memo, and you're going to be doing some things differently. Can you talk a little bit about what you're going to be doing differently at Citi?
Well, sir, I can do that, but I do want to take the lens of kind of responsibilities for the gaps that exist. It's not just the corporate accountability that I think is important. We also have to think about systematic policies that disproportionately affect minorities and people of color. And these are policies that have to do with voter suppression. These are policies that have to do with, the history, the legacy of, and frankly, continued home ownership, redlining, whether it's in fact or de facto or de jure. And these are things that interact with each other. Housing affects property taxes, which affects ability to fund schools, which affects education, which affects wage gaps. Housing also affects having collateral, which is important for loans. So these are interrelationships that are important, and these are ones that are policies that are above the corporate level and need to be addressed as well. So it's not just the responsibility of corporations to kind of get with the program here, but it is also the case that corporations perhaps have a smaller group of the shareholders are a smaller group than the voting public of the entire nation. So the corporations can move more nimbly. and they can move to address some of these issues in a more nimble way. And that is exactly what Citi has done. It has put together more than $1 billion in order to address explicitly some of these gaps that were identified in our report, but also, have been well known for quite some time, having to do with the availability of credit, working with minority development institutions, both directly in terms of funding, but also indirectly in terms of giving those institutions co-financing opportunities. As I said, housing is a very important ingredient in both wealth creation and development, but also as collateral. It's a very important ingredient when we talk about developing small business, that a house as collateral, it has been an important factor in terms of small business at its initial phases of entrepreneurship. And the fact of the matter is that that home ownership for minorities is lower now than it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And this is a problem. This is part of the reason why we wrote the report, is that progress has been unwound as opposed to progress being continued moving forward. So we're also focusing on $550 million into home ownership through local institutions and affordable housing development. And then finally, of course, we are also working with community funding through the Citi Foundation. So there are a number of different branches of the strategy that Citi has put into place. That's just a quick overview. A lot more individual details, particularly on the financial side, because of course we do have community outreach. It builds on our strength in these communities.
I'm curious to know how a regular person is going to be able to get access, and how it's going to actually work. If you are an African American this year, it's just been a lot of pain and then a lot of promise and a lot of promises. So, so it's exciting. You look on your phone and you see, oh my God, another person has been killed. There's another terrible video. I'm never gonna look at my phone again. Then you look at your phone and it's like, oh my goodness, a corporation is going to do something. People are putting $1 billion here. They're going to put $1 billion there. So we're kind of trapped, right, between all these painful videos and all these promises that are being made. I'm curious, just how are you going to make sure that this actually gets down to the regular person? Talk about Citigroup's commitment to making sure this actually makes a real difference beyond the announcements and the intentions.
Well, this is, I think the point is that this is a very complex problem, has been one for some time. And that means that the solution requires partnerships. The solution is not a silver bullet that money can solve everything, because it can't. So it's a partnership with these minority development institutions. These are the ones who are going to get the money. And then we get to work with people like Robert, who says, this is how you actually get it done at the local level. We have people at that local level, so we have partnerships and relationships already, but more needs to be developed. And that's where, taking the money into the institutions, who then are the ones who know the local community. And so that's the strategy.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And that ability to partner across difference. I mean, we talk about diversity, we talk about inclusion. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is an ability to partner across difference for win-win outcomes. So everybody's better off than they would be before. Now, Mellody, you've been, again, a huge champion of this for a long time. What do you find when you find that there's resistance to this idea, and you have to speak past it? What are the arguments that you're making that you think move people? I can be on TV all day long talking about this stuff. You get a chance to talk to people one-on-one. You got a lot of people watching you one-on-one who you've had these conversations with. What are the kinds of arguments that can be marshaled to have more stuff happening like what was just described by Citigroup?
You have to believe these efforts lead to a bigger pie. And if there is a bigger pie, that ultimately is good for everyone, certainly good for the U.S. economy. To the extent there is economic equality in our country, our economy is going to grow faster, more people will participate in it, it's better for business. So just from your own enlightened self-interest, this makes a lot of sense. And that is something that people don't always have the ability to see the cause and the effect and how it directly affects them. And so I think one of the things to really help people to understand is the contribution that particularly Black and brown people make when they are fully appreciated and absorbed into our economy, from tax base to all sorts of other things, and how that benefits our economy and the world. So that's my best argument. And if you don't get that, I mean, I don't know what else I can say to move you. I would say also there's a couple of things though that are very important. We're talking a lot about access to capital, and just to
Right.
slightly put a nuance on this narrative, at Ariel, we talk not just about access to capital, but access to customers. Because I can tell you, if I've got a book of receivables and I'm a Black business, I can go to a bank and get a loan. But if I don't have any customers, even with capital, I am facing a tough slog. And so we want companies to put those two ideas together. And so that really pushes corporate America to think about business diversity. Last century's conversation and nomenclature and lingo we have trouble with words like procurement or minority purchasing. Robert and I both know no one procures investment banking or procures private equity or procures investment management services or legal services. You procure manufacturing or old school things like construction, etc., which isn't where our economy is going. The biggest areas of corporate spend today are in professional services, financial services, and technology. And yet, the ways in which businesses have talked about including Black and brown businesses in their corporate spend don't often touch those areas. So what do we think you can do? Again, I'm into counting. I love that line, math has no opinion. You count across category, across everything you buy. Do you have the opportunity to use diverse vendors? So if Robert gets them that loan, I want to make sure the customer can be there for them to have that business that can pay that loan back over time.
I think that's really, really remarkable because it is a complex problem, as been stated. Government has a role, family has a role, community has a role. I think the private sector can probably in the short term have the biggest impact because of how nimble it can be. But if you got to move smart. Robert, talk a little bit about the importance of getting tier one capital into the communities that we're talking about, how that can be done, what's in the way, what arguments. I mean, you've been talking to Milken. I mean, you've been talking to a lot of people. What are the effective arguments? I assume anybody watching this is at least remotely open to the ideas, but they got to convince other people.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about the importance of getting the tier one capital where it needs to go, and some of the arguments have been working for you in these new halls of power that you've been walking through.
Sure. I think, and I'm going to pick up a little bit off of what Mellody said here, and the importance, what I'll call, and I characterize it as an ecosystem. Economies work in ecosystems of suppliers, ecosystems of service providers, producers, manufacturers, and we all need to impress upon corporations and policymakers, to Catherine's point, the importance of looking at the ecosystem of development, because it is truly that $2 trillion a year of economic uplift that comes from eliminating the wealth disparity with African Americans in this country and white Americans in this country. And what I've found is that the activity around COVID, the activity around the murder of George Floyd, and the recognition of the racial disparities has created a movement of thought and now a movement of action. And I'm pleased to work with folks on the board of the Business Roundtable, where we have Mary Barra, for instance, chairing Education Workforce Committee. I'm co-chairing one finance committee with Jamie Dimon, and Craig Arnold is focused on equitable justice, and Arnie Sorensen on healthcare. And what has been impressive is these CEOs, these executives, have all decided to think about this holistically and say, okay, what can we do as corporations? Very specific actions. For instance, just as Catherine talked about, Citibank is saying, guess what? We're going to put $100 million to support MDI's growth. Well, if they put the $100 million into tier one, tier two capital, it's an 8-to-1 lift. Okay, if you put a deposit, they can in essence just lend the earnings off of that. In a zero interest rate environment, there's not much. But if you actually go put it as an investment, they actually can create massive lift in the ecosystem of capital into our communities. So what's coming out of the BRT report, which will be announced, I believe it's next week, there's a support for MDI Tier 1, Tier 2, and a commitment to go to $600 million by 2025, multiplied times 8, right? So you get a sense, $5 billion you can push into these MDI CDFIs, the MDIs, and then an additional $1 billion in the form of grants, low-cost debt to CDIs, and then of course supporting everything as it relates to housing, because it's a great point Catherine's making. Housing is critically important to start building some infrastructure of wealth ecosystem opportunity for African American and Latinx members of our citizenry here. So it's critically important to think about this all in the form of an ecosystem. It has been exciting to see that every time you have these conversations, people say, oh, that makes sense. How do I do it? And now it's exciting to see groups like the Business Roundtable not only saying, here's what we're going to do as corporations, looking in the mirror and signing up to things, but also through the window and saying, let's put forward policy recommendations to not just current administration, but to also members of Congress, and saying, here's what we think makes sense, because it supports the entire ecosystem of American uplift in creating jobs and opportunity and eliminating the first of all, call it the income disparity, but ultimately the wealth disparity and what that leads to in terms of economic opportunity for all of us.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about another form of capital, which I think this conference represents, which is social capital. I think a lot of times when I'm on airplanes, I see a lot of African Americans. They're reading a book about prosperity, about investment, about how to get ahead in life. I think there's a myth that somehow African Americans just forgot to be ambitious. Somehow African Americans just forgot that we want to have stuff and own stuff and be successful. I think nothing is farther from the truth. You go to a Black church, they're praying for prosperity. They're passing around books. They're doing circle clubs. They're doing all prayer circles. There's nobody really excited about staying poor. Certainly not in America. And yet, for all the books that are read and all the preachers and all the prayers, and sometimes even good intentions, something falls short. And I believe it's in the area of social capital. People who are highly successful, they didn't get it out of a book. They didn't get it out of a prayer circle. They met somebody. A human being took them under the wing. A human being talked to them and helped them and moved them along. I want to take a little bit. Let's talk about we've all been cheerleading for this stuff. What's in the way? How can we have more and better relationship, mentorship? I mean, Robert, you do it, all the time. Mellody, you do it all the time. I'm sure you do it at Citi. But talk a little bit about the real stuff that's in the way. We don't know each other well enough, do we? How can we begin to get a different set of social capital relationships going? Anybody, jump ball.
I'll jump in first, just to give some perspective. Van, this is the first generation of African Americans that are now in corporations, are now in positions where not only do they, control assets and have the ability to influence them, they can actually control pipelines of people in their development. And I wouldn't necessarily say that we don't know each other. We just are now the first time in the positions of influence to make a difference. And there's groups that get together, and I know Mellody's been hosting one for decades now. Boards of directors, African American boards of directors who network, and there's a group in Boca that does it, that actually got involved and said, all right, during this time, what can we do? And part of that this 2% solution came into the idea of this equitable progress sustainability bond, which a member of those folks were on board to say, all right, let me get my corporations to sign up to this as well and issue these bonds to help solve these problems. So look, there's components of infrastructure, from internships to mentorships. We just have to now, for the first generation of us who are now in corporate America or controlling assets, have to now build more flesh on the bones and make sure it's more robust in terms of what the ongoing pipeline of opportunity is and how we support it.
Catherine, how do you see it?
If I get it, yeah. So I'm going to take a slightly less sanguine view because I think that there have been people waiting outside, waiting on the wings of the pipeline for a very long time, and haven't been. It's not like they didn't have the capability to do what the people inside were doing. They just weren't invited. And even now, when inside, there's run the risk of being an outsider on the inside, being one of at a meeting or something like that. So Citi really has taken this on sort of the self-assessment thing where you really look at kind of your numbers. As you know, Citi has done some pretty significant self-assessment on the gender front that they have come out public on. They're now doing this on the minority front as well, and as a result, have put into place some important discussions, as well as the accountability part that Mellody was mentioning. You got to measure it. You got to believe your numbers, and then say, okay, what are we going to do? And you have to work within the organization structure that you have. You don't start with a clean slate. You've got what you got, but then you start to talk about what do we know about the challenges of people of color in the workplace. Citi now has a whole series of let's talk about it. And frankly, it comes from the very top. You might recall, after George Floyd, Mark Mason wrote a very searing personal blog, and Mike Corbett responded to that, saying, "I've known you for decades, and I never really knew." So we have to talk about it. So we are internal to the business. We are talking about it, and we also have in place not just the mentorships and so forth, but we're making a distinction between mentoring, which is helping somebody on their career path, and advocacy. Now, an advocate is different from a mentor. An advocate is somebody who says, you need to go talk to these 5 people because your career, whatever you're going to do, you need to know them. You need to be part of their network. You might not think about going and knocking on their door, but me as your advocate, I'm giving you license. Not only am I giving you license, I'm telling you, go do it. So it's both it's an opening the door, but also a shove in. Not just leaning in, a shove in. And so these are things that are being done within Citi to because we've really tried to take this on and be the do the numbers and have accountability.
Mellody, how do you see it?
So it's interesting. I was thinking about the fact that, everyone talks about mentorship and the socialization piece, and we went at it in a slightly different way, which is not unusual for Ariel. And our idea was, how do we mentor each other? So not who mentors us, but in terms of each other and at the senior most levels, because everyone thinks of mentorship as the young person coming in. So we decided a few years ago, probably 20 by now, to start this Black Corporate Directors Conference that we do with Russell Reynolds and Deloitte. And we bring together the Fortune 500 Black directors. And in recent years, we've added Latinx directors. Van, you've been there. Robert, you've been there. These are the most powerful people in corporate America. Now, you would say, why are you mentoring them? We're not, I don't want to say that in a condescending way, where we're pushing each other and hold each other accountable. We say, if you get that precious seat in the boardroom, because even today, white men make up 30% of the US population, but 70% of all board seats. So it's still that precious seat when you get it in the boardroom. We want to make sure that your fiduciary responsibility includes the civil rights agenda, because we think that makes a business a better business. And so we brought these individuals together, and we use that as an opportunity to push each other, to learn from each other, to hold each other accountable, to ask questions about what trees are you planting? What power are you using for good for the community that's ultimately in the best interest of the company? So there are all sorts of ways you can get at this social issue. And we've decided to go to some white space in terms of, people are always talking about this mentorship and these social, this social hierarchy from, quote, the pipeline. And we said, let's start at the top. And at the top, let's see how we can change the narrative in such a way that we can act on one accord. And we have something called the 3 Ps, which is people, purchasing, and philanthropy. Whereas a group, we're saying we're going to have a commitment to this call to action around these issues of making sure the organization is diverse from top to bottom and measuring across ethnicity, no multicultural umbrella that says, here's our multicultural group that includes women, doesn't work. We want to see it by ethnicity, by gender. Purchasing, I've already talked about. Let's see the business diversity broken out. And then last but not least, philanthropy. Now, my worry, and just my last point, is lately I think there's a lot of virtue signaling going on, and the philanthropy is the tail that's wagging the dog. People are feeling very good about the donations they're making to civil rights, Black and Latinx organizations. I'm happy for that support, but I want to make sure corporations understand you cannot fix your house from without. You must fix it from within. And those donations are important, but at the end of the day, again, the corporation must hold itself accountable. So we're asking those Black and brown directors to be a part of that holding the institutions accountable. And we are shoring each other up, training each other, giving each other ammunition, etc., when we come together in the Black Corporate Directors Conference.
Well, look, I mean, since we're talking about these kind of dynamics, let's just get a little bit more real. Somebody might hear this and say, well, hold on a second. If I put a Black or brown director on my board, then they're going to come in with the whole civil rights agenda. I'm for that, but what about me making my money, et cetera? Can we just talk about the fear factor? I would imagine, and I'm going to throw this to you, Robert, but I would imagine that there's a cross-pressuring going on for a lot of people who are watching this. On the one hand, their hearts are touched. They don't like seeing these videos any more than anybody else does. They would love to make a difference if they could. And they may even feel some guilt or some self reflection in terms of what they have not done. But then that's the push. On the other side, there's the pull. If I pick somebody and they come in, are they going to blow up the spot? Is there headline risk in me now because there's so much attention? If I do the right thing the wrong way, am I going to be even worse off? How do you talk to leaders who are now walking through the change management process in their own heart about the promise versus the peril of making a change? Rob?
Yeah, I think there is a macro issue that needs to be recognized, identified, then what I call the micro implementation of what you do. The macro issue, I think, is pretty straightforward. And Catherine did a great job articulating it. And we've had folks at McKinsey, BCG, and others been working with us and the BRT evaluating it. Short answer is this is a global economy, and I still do and absolutely believe in myself as a globalist, and have to think about it in that context. It is a global economy that is skewing digital at a faster rate than was even anticipated this time last year. COVID has been one of the accelerants of that. And so we have to enable the competitive structure in U.S. companies to evolve effectively. And the only way we're going to do that is to enable our citizenry to be effective contributors to the productivity of this country. What that says is we have to enact measures, policies, activities to ensure that all of our people are educated, I will underscore, in STEM, and enabled to participate productively in a workforce, which then leads to, of course, more stable communities and an opportunity for income disparities to be eliminated and ultimately wealth disparities to also dissipate. It's critically important to start with that narrative of it's an economic imperative, and I say that because there has been a digitization on this planet, a distribution of computing capacity, which is going to accelerate economic growth everywhere. And if we do not accelerate at a faster rate, or at least at an equal rate of everywhere else on the planet, then we will fall further behind as a society longer term. So that's the economic imperative. And then the actions is, go to groups like the Business Roundtable, where there's been massive amount of thought put into where can I actually do the best good with the dollars that I have available? How do I do it in the form of looking in the mirror first? It starts at home. How do I do the development programs, building up the capacity at mid-level, senior level, and board level to ensure that I've got racial diversity that encompasses the citizenry that makes up my workforce and makes up the consuming body of the products and services that I sell. And then, ultimately evaluate other programs that, have been vetted by these sort of organizations and saying, here's how you go put, $1 billion or $500 million or 200 million or whatever the number might be into affordable housing that affects my community, or how do you put it into ensuring that we alleviate the burden of student debt, for instance, for students who've been disproportionately affected. So there are institutions out there that are doing the work, but I think the way I overcome it is start with the macro. Here's why there's a economic imperative, and then here are the places where people are actually doing the work, and here are the folks in Congress and administration that you can talk to who are like-minded in their pursuit and goals, and can actually help affect some policies that are long-lasting and sustainable.
If I could just add a point, Van, just to get to your question also very directly in terms of what about the fear of that person who comes in who has the civil rights agenda on their mind? I want to underscore, I'm not for one issue directors. So I don't think that works. You won't be very good at what you do. You can have a very diverse point of view, which is why you're in the room. So I am very clear about when I'm on a board, I'm a financial expert, I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman. I can go through a whole lot of things. I have communication skills that are very strong, etc., that make me valuable to that institution, hopefully. And so why don't I get to bring all those things in the room and have an opinion about them, as opposed to isolating around issues that perhaps make people uncomfortable, which at the end of the day are in the best interest of the institution. I would argue that not having these conversations puts companies at greater risk than ever before. No matter what we would like to believe, these civil rights issues are at the front door of corporate America in ways they have never been before. Many of the social issues of our society are at the front door of corporate America. Who could ever have imagined we'd be doing live shooter drills in companies, or there would be mental health benefits for individuals, or that we would have these situations around race that show up in these ways. And so because this is now the new frontier, in the 60s, it was government. Today, it's corporate. We have to recognize the risks that are embedded in not talking about these issues and not having that representation in the boardroom. I have a question. I don't know if it'll happen or not. As you know, at Ariel, we are investors in businesses. We spend our lives reading annual reports, etc. And when you read a proxy statement, you see all sorts of risks that the company wants to lay out for you. And in recent years, we see a lot more in the way of ESG risk. They'll talk about environmental issues, etc. I'm wondering when the racial discussion will end up in the proxy around risk for companies that are not diverse. Because I think it has there is meaningful risk related to those issues.
Yeah. Well,
you speak of risk. I speak of opportunity. How much money are you leaving on the table if your board doesn't have a diverse point of view? Right? That's the key. The relationship between diversity in boards or diversity in portfolio managers and the outcome, the bottom line, is pretty clear. We can talk about our causality all day long, but the point is that they both go in the same direction. So just as you're right to say that there are risks from having a unitary approach to a board, there are opportunities and money being left on the table. And usually shareholders don't like to see money left on the table.
Well, okay, Catherine, I want to keep talking with you about this because I think the old way of thinking was this topic is too risky to talk about. And it's not worth it anyway because, there's not that much money. There's not that many smart people over there. We're not really losing anything. Now, in this conversation, we're saying it's too risky to not talk about it. And there's massive opportunity.
Right.
But, some things you have to see to believe. There's some things you have to believe to see. And this is one of those, you kind of have to believe it at first to see it. I want to know why you got there first. In other words, I can tell when you're talking, you talked about these numbers. You like these numbers. I don't think it's just about numbers for you. I think there's something underneath those numbers in your heart. Could you just speak as a human being why you care enough to go get all these numbers? Why do you care about this stuff?
I care about it because I have friends, I have neighbors. I have been a professor. I've been a professor at Brandeis University, and the thing about being a professor is that you always have the people in the front row who are going to get an A. That's fine. But the ones that I found most challenging and the ones that I wanted to reach out to the most were the people who I saw had great opportunity and were not either taking advantage of it or weren't being given an opportunity to take advantage of who they could be. So in some sense, when I see missed opportunities, they are far worse to me than a risk. I mean, you got to take an opportunity. You've got to help people take opportunities, open the doors, and maybe that just comes from my background as a teacher.
I love hearing that because I think there's a lot of people who are part of this conference who have that in them. And you almost get taught to disconnect from that. I'm like, that might get in the way of me having a rational analysis. And I'm not going to think about the people I grew up with anymore. I'm not going to think about that Uber driver I thought was super smart and I wish they could have a shot at life. But in fact, I believe we now be in a different era where connecting that kind of emotional intelligence, that care for people, you got a bunch of customers out there, these younger customers, they're looking for that in a company. And that may also be a doorway to getting more talent in the door. I want to just we only have a few more minutes, but there's a human dimension to this, Robert. And there's a human dimension to this, Mellody. And I want to talk about that. Robert, you shocked the world when you went to Morehouse and announced that all those young people, you were going to forgive their student debts and their student loans. And it stunned people. I've always said you're like the Tony Stark of the Black community, but you've always been in the lab. Nobody saw you put on your Iron Man suit and walk out in public and do what you do behind the scenes. Talk about that moment and why you did that and what that should allow for other business leaders to do.
Yeah, it's interesting because I actually didn't think it was going to be that big of a moment, to be frank with you. I was doing what I thought is the right thing to do in liberating these 400 families of the burden. And, some of the work that we've done in fulfilling that pledge and others is realize that over 60% of African American wealth in the community goes towards servicing student debt, which is just an astounding number. And, when I think about that, A, they end up with more debt when they graduate. B, the jobs typically are, the pay disparity and income disparity creates a broader wealth disparity, and you end up with issues of defaulting and ultimately, it just inhibits the cycle, and that ecosystem is broken. And so we've been introduced a new program called Student Freedom Initiative, which is think about a self-funding dynamic. The first tranche we've done will now fund all STEM students from 11 HBCUs in perpetuity. And now we're raising capital to do it for all STEM students from HBCUs in perpetuity. So when you talk about, what can I do as a corporation or foundation? Here's a very natural way to solve a problem. I call it an engineered solution forever. So it isn't a one-time, it can solve that problem forever. And, I think the important thing that we do, the humanistic part of it, is actually think about what can we do to liberate the human spirit? What can we do to eliminate the wealth and income disparities in this country that have been, historically, call it driven by a perception of, call it race or ethnicity, that is the wrong answer, given that we have to compete in a global economy and we have to get every citizen activated as we can. And that's really how I think about marrying the two concepts and what you can actually do today as an individual or as a corporation or as a policymaker to help that issue.
Well, I'm going to give the last word to you, Mellody. Way before Time's Up and Me Too and all that kind of discussion, you were on television talking about women in the workplace and women as entrepreneurs and women as investors. Way before Black Lives Matter and all this sort of stuff. I mean, you have really been a pioneer of the pioneers of the pioneers. How does it feel to you, just at a human level, to look around and seeing these kind of conversations, main stage of conferences like this, main stage all around the world? I mean, just talk a little bit to us about what it feels like to have been so early, to have had to make the case when nobody was really making it, and what you hope for going forward.
Well, you're right. I did this TED Talk in 2014 called Color Brave. And I talk about in that talk that many people discouraged me from doing a TED Talk on race. They thought it would be a very, very bad idea. And that, of course, piqued my interest and made me even more interested in talking about a subject that I said is like the third rail that, people run away from. And I push people in that conversation to get comfortable with the uncomfortable conversation about race. And I asked people to invite people in their life who didn't look like them, who didn't think like them, who didn't come from where they came from, in an effort to have a more tolerant world so that we could all be more informed and ultimately more tolerant. And yes, that was 6 years ago, and it feels like it was yesterday. And it feels like nothing happened between that 2014 TED Talk and today. And so there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance going on in my mind, because on the one hand, I think it's incredibly important. I'm glad to see it's happening. But at the same time, I will tell you again, I go back to talk is not enough. And I want to make sure that we come out of this with real action, because we've been to this movie so many times now. The killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others is not new. It just happened to be caught on camera this time. This idea of promoting outrage in people that would lead to action was King's playbook. It was Gandhi's playbook. Let's bring the cameras down south so they can see hoses and dogs turned on young people, and see if that opens up the American heart and the American spirit to affect change. So this has all been done before. My words are not new. However, I think I've been trying to do my best to just press the issue as much as possible. And I'm happy to see, especially in corporate America, one of the places where there's been the most discomfort in talking about this issue about race, that people do understand it's incredibly necessary. The last thing I'll say, when you ask about what gives me hope and what might make for this time to be different, should you have gone in that direction, I would just say that the world holds you accountable now. The idea that the viral nature of our society, your people who work for you inside the company are going to hold you accountable. Your customers will hold you accountable. Those outside of the company will hold you accountable. We've seen this now over and over again. So if you don't mean it, don't say it.
Well, look, this has been a huge honor for me. I'm obviously massive fan of all you guys and your great work. And it gives me a little bit of hope, because I tell you, I think we've got the wrong idea in America. I think that people in my business, the media business, have done a very good job of convincing people something that's not true. That the problem in America is we have too many awful people. If you're on the right, it's too many awful Democrats, socialists, race card players. If you're on the left, too many awful Republicans. They're bigoted, and we have all these awful people. There may be some awful people. It's probably the smallest problem that we have. The biggest problem that we have so many awesome people in both political parties, all races, in the public sector, in the private sector, at the community level, who just haven't figured out what to do together yet. And what I love about all three of you is you're giving people concrete ways to move forward together. Doesn't matter your race, your background, where you are, public, private, left, right. This stuff makes sense. This stuff makes sense. And so if we can just realize if we have an awesome people problem, and now we've got some awesome solutions, I think we're going to have a much better 2021 than we had 2020 and before. So just thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your work. I got more questions, but we don't have more time. Thank you very much. And thank you, Milken.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you.
you, man. Thank you. Good seeing you, Catherine.